The city did not wake up to a death. It woke up to silence. It was not the kind of silence that arrives with dawn. It was heavier. Pressed flat against concrete walls and glass corridors, it lingered as though the night had forgotten how to leave. In a residential complex designed to promise safety and distance from the chaos below, lights remained on long past their usual hour. Doors stayed closed. No sirens cut the air. No voices gathered. The city, usually impatient with tragedy, chose not to look. The discovery came without ceremony. A young man, widely known and carefully managed by a system that thrived on visibility, was found lifeless in a place meant for rest. There was no official announcement to follow. No detailed report. Only fragments passed quietly from one phone to another, each stripped of context, each more cautious than the last. In the hours that followed, the absence of information became its own presence. We are often told that death leaves a trail. Footsteps. Evidence. Witnesses. In this case, what remained was an immaculate gap. Security cameras that should have recorded movement offered nothing useful. Segments of data were said to be corrupted. Maintenance logs showed irregular access times that were later explained, then quietly revised. The building's staff did not speak. Those who might have noticed something claimed to remember very little. According to individuals familiar with the aftermath, the body bore marks that were quickly concealed. Makeup was applied with unusual care. Clothing was adjusted. The presentation suggested calm. The reality beneath it did not. One person from the inner circle hinted, briefly, that what they had seen did not align with the narrative forming outside. That message disappeared within minutes. Screenshots circulated for a short time before they too vanished. What unsettled observers most was not the lack of answers, but the speed with which questions were discouraged. Friends who attempted to inquire were advised to wait. Professionals who could have clarified details declined interviews. A name spoken too loudly became a liability. Silence did not need enforcement. It spread on its own. We must pause here, not to speculate, but to acknowledge a pattern. In cases like this, confusion is rarely accidental. When information collapses inward, it often does so by design. The public sees a single event. Those closer to it sense a boundary they are not meant to cross. As the night turned into morning, and morning into an uneasy day, one detail surfaced and refused to settle. A whispered assertion from someone who had no reason to embellish and every reason to remain quiet. The words did not accuse. They did not explain. They merely disrupted the fragile order being constructed. He did not die where he was found. That statement changed everything. It suggested movement, preparation, intent. It implied that the scene presented was not an ending, but a conclusion arranged after something else had already taken place. We were no longer looking at a moment of loss. We were looking at a process. And that was when we realized the body was only the beginning. The first mistake investigators often make is believing that a scene belongs to the person found within it. In reality, a scene belongs to whoever controls it last. By the time anyone outside the inner perimeter became aware of the death, the location had already been stripped of spontaneity. What remained was arrangement. The room itself appeared unremarkable. Clean surfaces. No sign of struggle that could not be dismissed as incidental. Objects were aligned with a precision that suggested intervention rather than neglect. The windows were closed. The air conditioning was running. Time in that space felt paused rather than interrupted. According to individuals with limited access to the aftermath, the body had been prepared before discovery. Bruising that would normally draw immediate attention had been carefully concealed beneath layers of cosmetic correction. The skin tone appeared even. The face showed no obvious distress. To an untrained observer, it could have passed as peaceful. To someone accustomed to working behind the scenes, it felt rehearsed. One person, part of a team tasked with maintaining public appearances, noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. The distribution of marks did not correspond to a fall or sudden collapse. The placement suggested restraint. Pressure applied and released with intention. This observation was shared privately, never documented, and later denied. When asked again, the individual claimed exhaustion and misremembering. Digital records offered no clarity. Surveillance footage from key corridors failed at crucial intervals. Not completely absent, but incomplete. Frames skipped. Timestamps drifted. Maintenance reports cited routine malfunctions. These explanations might have sufficed if the failures were isolated. They were not. Each gap aligned too neatly with moments that could have answered uncomfortable questions. We should be careful here. Gaps do not prove orchestration, but patterns demand attention. In environments built on control and repetition, randomness is rare. When several independent systems falter in coordination, coincidence becomes difficult to defend. A secondary detail emerged from someone responsible for post-discovery logistics. The individual recalled being instructed to wait before contacting emergency services. The delay was brief, just long enough perhaps for final adjustments. When asked later, the same person insisted that no such delay occurred. Memory in this case appeared flexible. What complicates matters further is the question of movement. A subtle one, easily overlooked. There were indications that the body had been repositioned. Not dragged, lifted, carefully. The posture did not match the reported location of collapse. Limbs rested in a manner that suggested placement rather than gravity. This observation circulated, quietly among a very small group, then stopped. At some point, someone attempted to speak publicly. A short message appeared online, expressing grief mixed with confusion. It hinted at a truth beneath the surface, without naming it. Within minutes, the post was removed. The account went inactive shortly after. No explanation followed. By then, the narrative had already begun to harden. A single version of events was taking shape, reinforced not by evidence, but by repetition. Those close enough to notice discrepancies learned to measure their words. Those further away sensed that something essential was missing, but could not articulate what it was. We are left then with a scene that refuses ownership. It does not belong to the man who died. It belongs to the sequence that followed him, to the hands that corrected, concealed, and curated what the world was allowed to see. And if the scene was altered with such care, the question becomes unavoidable. What required that level of control? Disappearances rarely happen all at once. They begin as omissions. First, someone does not answer a call. Then an account goes quiet. Then, a familiar name is no longer attached to any public trace. In the weeks following the death, the pattern did not present itself as a series of dramatic vanishing acts. It presented itself as a gradual thinning of the human perimeter around the truth. There were those who had been close enough to see something. A staff member who worked late hours and understood the building's rhythms. A driver who knew which entrances were used when attention needed to be avoided. A neighbor who heard movement in the corridor at a time when the floor should have been asleep. Each person by themselves meant little. Together they formed a fragile chain. That chain broke with surprising speed. A rumor surfaced first, the kind that travels not because it is credible, but because it is specific. It claimed that a man had been found near an entrance in the early hours, not as a passerby, but as someone who tried to intervene. The rumor carried an additional detail that made it harder to dismiss. The man was not merely discovered. He was silenced. The allegation was never confirmed. It did not need to be. Its function was to change behavior. People began to ask fewer questions. Then came another story, quieter, more disturbing in its implication. A young woman described only as a devoted admirer was said to have been present at the wrong moment. In this version, she did not intend to become part of anything. She simply saw too much. The account spread briefly, then dissolved into the same fog that had swallowed everything else. What remained was not the narrative itself, but the residue of fear it left behind. From there, the pattern broadened. A couple who allegedly passed through the area at the critical time stopped responding to friends. A professional who had been known to speak plainly about ethical violations suddenly canceled all scheduled work and became unreachable. A photographer who once hinted at foul play vanished from public view, as if the entire profession had agreed not to notice. None of these details can be treated as proof. But they do not need to be proof to become pressure. We have seen this mechanism before, in other cases, in other environments where power is not announced but implied. The goal is not necessarily to remove everyone. The goal is to make the remaining people feel as if removal is possible. Fear does not require certainty. Fear only requires precedent. The most unsettling reports concern those tasked with documentation. The individuals who might have produced records that could outlast rumor. A medical worker who allegedly observed injuries inconsistent with an official narrative. A service employee who handled the aftermath. A figure in the professional orbit who had access to the body before it was presented to the public. One by one, they became absent. Some were said to be resting. Some traveled. Some simply stopped existing in the spaces where they had once been visible. Even family ties offered no sanctuary in the story that formed around the silence. Names connected by blood were mentioned as unaccounted for. Not confirmed as missing, not publicly declared endangered, but increasingly described as unreachable. In a more ordinary reality, such an absence would provoke urgent inquiry. Here, it produced something colder. Resignation. At a certain point, the pattern achieved its real effect. People began to self-edit. Friends stopped speaking on record. Colleagues avoided mentioning dates. Private grief became public caution. The perimeter of the case did not shrink because someone forcibly removed every witness. It shrank because everyone learned the cost of proximity. And then, a fragment surfaced that made the fear feel less like rumor and more like instruction. A short piece of audio, unverified and low in quality, circulated in private messages. The voice was indistinct, but the phrasing was clear. It did not threaten. It did not explain. It simply stated a rule, as if the rule had existed long before this case. If you speak, you become part of it. The message carried an implication more terrifying than violence. It suggested inevitability. It suggested that silence was not merely a tactic. It was a boundary. And those who crossed it did not just risk consequences. They risked absorption into something larger, something already moving. By the time the wider public noticed the pattern had already done its work. It had rewritten the environment. Not with announcement, not with declarations, but with absence. And the more people disappeared, the more one question refused to leave us alone. If so many had to vanish to keep the story contained, what exactly were they trying to contain? Not every ritual announces itself with symbols drawn on the floor or words spoken aloud. Some rituals are quieter. They unfold in timing, repetition, and spectacle. They hide in plain sight, embedded in performances meant to distract rather than reveal. In the days following the death, attention shifted. Public appearances resumed. Schedules moved forward. Yet something in the atmosphere had changed. Those who watched closely began to notice patterns that did not belong to coincidence. The first sign was visual. A performance staged shortly after the incident carried imagery that felt misaligned with its supposed purpose. Lighting washed the space in deep red hues. Smoke lingered longer than necessary, blurring the edges of the stage. A massive, unblinking eye appeared in projection, hovering above performers who moved with deliberate, almost trance-like precision. Human-shaped figures stood motionless at the margins, arranged not for aesthetics but for symmetry. To the casual viewer, it was art. To those already unsettled, it felt instructional. Rituals do not require belief to function. They require participation, an audience that watches, a stage that repeats, a structure that assigns roles without explanation. In this case, the structure was unmistakable. The imagery was not chaotic. It was consistent. Each element returned night after night, city after city, as if adherence mattered more than interpretation. Then there was the timing. The appearance occurred on the 7th day after the reported death. In many traditions, this day carries weight. It marks transition, return, departure. Whether or not the performers acknowledged this significance publicly was irrelevant. The alignment alone was enough to disturb those familiar with symbolic cycles. It suggested intention, not accident. Observers described the atmosphere as oppressive. The music pulsed at a frequency that felt physical rather than auditory. Movements repeated in loops, hands rising and falling in unison, bodies turning as if guided rather than directed. At one point, figures collapsed to the floor simultaneously, only to be lifted again, repositioned and left standing, vacant. It is important to state what this was not. It was not evidence of a crime. It was not proof of a conspiracy. What it was, however, was a performance that mirrored the emotional architecture of the case itself. Control, submission, witnessing without intervention. We must consider why such imagery would emerge at such a moment. Not as a confession, not as a message to authorities, but as something else entirely, a signal inward. A reaffirmation that whatever process had begun was still active. Rituals often serve a single purpose, to mark passage from one state to another, from presence to absence, from individual to symbol. If that is the case here, then the death was not the culmination. It was the threshold. This reframes everything that came before. The altered scene, the silenced witnesses, the disappearances. Each becomes a necessary condition rather than an isolated anomaly. The process required containment. It required erasure. It required a moment where the loss could be acknowledged without being explained. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, it required an audience willing to watch without asking why. At this stage, the central question shifts. It is no longer about who caused the death or how it occurred. Those questions belong to investigations that may never happen. The question that remains belongs to us. If this was a ritual, it was not designed to punish the victim. It was designed to reach someone else. And if that is true, then the ritual is not finished. It does not end with a body. It ends when its message is received. In the aftermath, what remained was not clarity, but compliance. No official reckoning arrived to settle the unease. No definitive account emerged to replace speculation. Instead, the environment adjusted. Schedules resumed. Faces reappeared in public with rehearsed composure. The system absorbed the shock and continued forward, leaving the unanswered behind. Those who survived the proximity learned quickly what survival required. It was not courage. It was restraint. Conversations became careful. Memories softened. Details that once felt urgent lost their edges. Silence did not announce itself as fear. It presented itself as professionalism, as discretion, as maturity. We are often told that time reveals truth. In some cases, time does the opposite. It normalizes absence. It teaches those who remain to live with gaps. The missing are not pursued. They are reclassified. Not as victims, not as witnesses, simply as unavailable. There is a particular cruelty in this kind of ending. Not because it is violent, but because it is quiet. Violence invites resistance. Quiet demands adaptation. People adjust their expectations downward. They accept that certain questions are inappropriate, that some stories are better left unfinished. From a distance, the case begins to resemble resolution. There is no visible unrest, no public mourning that exceeds acceptable bounds. The event is folded into a broader narrative of misfortune and moved aside. Yet beneath that surface, the structure that made it possible remains intact. Rituals, when successful, leave no debris. They do not announce completion. They simply alter behavior. If the purpose was to demonstrate consequence without explanation, then it succeeded. The message did not need to be broadcast. It was absorbed. We must acknowledge an uncomfortable truth here. Systems that operate without accountability do not rely on secrecy alone. They rely on participation, on the willingness of individuals to trade understanding for safety, to accept survival as compensation. This is where the story truly ends, not with the death itself, but with the choice that followed it. The choice to remain present at the cost of inquiry, to continue forward without asking who else paid the price. Because in stories like this, survival is never free.